This year I set myself a challenge of reading 50 books. It's going pretty well at the moment, but I had to ask myself a question, just how much of what I read do I actually remember? Hey guys, I'm Danny Jack, welcome to my channel. I'm a wedding photographer based in the UK and I'm a giant productivity nerd. With weddings being on hold this year, for reasons you can probably guess, I have a bit more free time than I normally would. I wanted to make sure that I didn't completely waste that time, so I thought I would set myself a challenge of reading more books. Reading is an important part of my life I sometimes don't give enough time to, and I owe a lot of the wins in my life to lessons I've learned in various books. Whether that be a productivity book like Make Time, or a habit filming book like Atomic Habits, or a book that encourages me to look at life a little bit differently, something like The Alchemist or Man's Search for Meaning. I love a good book and I always think it's a good use of my time and I'm very grateful for them. The problem though, up until more recently, is that even though I read a lot of books, not a lot of it sticks in my brain. I often find myself reading a book and finding it absolutely fantastic and thinking it's life-changing at a time, but when I revisit the book, maybe try and think about it a year later, not that much is stuck. I kind of can remember the key concepts, but not a lot more. I'm sure there's something that sticks somewhere in my long-term memory, but it doesn't come easily for me to kind of recall what I read in those books. So a few months ago, I decided to put more time into figuring out exactly how do you remember more of what you read. And this video is exactly what that's about. It's about how I remember more of what I read, some of the tips I've picked up along the way, what works for me. If you find any of this stuff useful, please press like, I'd really appreciate it, and let's get into the video. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is knowing the difference between active and passive reading. Most of us know how to read passively pretty well. It's probably our default state of reading. It's what we would normally use for reading like a fictional book or reading something for entertainment. Just kind of like absorbing the words, taking them at face value, not really thinking of it, just enjoying the ride and just reading the words as they're written. When you're reading passively, you're not really reading to get specific information from a book. You're kind of just taking everything as it is and just letting everything come to your mind without really stopping to digest or to analyze what you read or to take notes or anything like that. You're just kind of reading it. It does work absolutely fine for fiction when it's entertainment, but for non-fiction, when you're trying to learn something new, it's not the best strategy. For that, you want to be doing more active reading, and this comes in many stages, but essentially what I'm saying here is just taking a lot more time to digest what you're reading, similar to how a student may look at a textbook. They won't just read it once, they might go back over things again, they might break things down, they might make notes, all of that kind of stuff kind of falls into the umbrella of active reading. To remember what you read, I would suggest going more down the active reading route. So this means reading like a student, which means eliminating distractions, reading intentionally, making sure you're making notes, all these kinds of things. Basically, reading with the intention that you're going to be using what you've read later on. Students will read a text normally to help them with an exam or with coursework, so they're reading with intention. They have a reason why they're reading that thing, and they're looking for specific information they can take out and apply for something later on. So how do we do that? How do we read more actively? You can break this down again into three more sections. One we'll call impression, one we'll call association, and one we'll call repetition. So first off, we want to make sure that we have a good impression of what it is we are reading. We want to know what to expect from the book. We kind of want to know what the key concepts are going to be going into it, what kind of information we're expecting to learn, what questions we want to be answered. Knowing all this stuff beforehand, maybe by doing a skim or by making sure you're paying attention to the chapter covers or maybe reading a book summary, will help you remember those key points later on. So I have a book we can use as an example for this. This is The First 20 Hours, How to Learn Anything Fast by Josh Kaufman. It's a great book, and I picked this book up with the intention of trying to figure out how to learn how to play chess quickly. Chess was one of those lockdown activities I decided to get into, but I didn't want to spend hundreds of hours learning this book. And I'd heard about this book by listening to one of Josh Kaufman's TED Talks, where he kind of talks about the same key concepts which are covered in this book of how to break a new skill down into something that you can learn. I then knew a little bit more about the book, but I think I heard about it in a podcast as well, and where Josh Kaufman talked about the key concepts in there as well. Obviously, I looked at things like the blurb, and I looked at all the chapters, all this kind of stuff before I actually started reading. Really helped me get like a good foundation of what to expect, so when it comes to memorizing what's in here, I kind of know what I need to be pulling out. As I know that my intention is to learn all of this stuff to learn how to play chess, I knew what was important to me and what wasn't. This also leads me quite well into the next part, which is association. So, as I'm sure you probably know, one of the best ways to learn something is to try and incorporate it into a world you already know. So taking that short-term knowledge and trying to mix it into long-term knowledge you already have, mixing everything together, and that way your short-term will much easier fit into your long-term memory. So there's a few ways you can do this with reading, but one thing I found works really well with me is using an app called Readwise. Readwise is a really cool little app, and basically what it does is it takes any highlights you have on a Kindle or any highlights you have on maybe articles or blog posts or all kinds of things, and it syncs them up with whatever note-taking app you might use. So in my case, I use Evernote. Evernote is what I use to put all my notes in, but you could sync up with like Notion or Roam Research and send all of your Kindle highlights into one place. Now, why is this so cool? Well, two reasons really. I think it's cool anyway. You might think it's quite nerdy, but I think it's cool. Basically what you can do is when you make these highlights, you can go into all of those highlights and look at all of them at a glance. And when you can see them, not only is that good for repetition because you're looking at these quotes again, but also you can start doing that association practice I was talking about. And what I mean by that is going through all of the highlighted notes you've already made and kind of rewriting things in your own words or finding ways that you can interpret it in your own world. Just to give you an example of what that looks like in practice, I'm currently reading Storyworthy by Matthew Dix. It's a great book about how to tell better stories. It's really cool. I think I'm learning quite a lot from it. And I've made quite a few highlights here, which I've synced from my Kindle over to my Evernote, which is on my phone or on my computer or whatever. And I can have a look through them and maybe just type up some notes. So here's a quote here which says, "Your story must reflect change over time. A story cannot simply be a series of remarkable events. You must start out as one version of yourself and end as something new." Okay, great quote. But to kind of help me associate this into my own existing memory, I put a note underneath here saying like, this is like all good movies like Star Wars or Indiana Jones or anything like that, where the protagonist changes over time. After the adventure, they are changed in some way and come back a new person. So that was kind of how I associated with my own world. I know movies pretty well, and when we talk about stories, that's kind of where my mind goes. Or another one here, just for another example, you must tell your own story and not the story of others. People would rather hear the story about what happened to you last night rather than about what happened to your friend Pete last night, even if Pete's story is better than your own. So I put underneath that, I've definitely had this experience of this practice when I try and tell someone else's story after being impressed by it myself. When telling someone else the same story, it doesn't seem impressive at all, and I find myself rushing through it. Another way you can kind of use association is by trying to explain what you've read to someone else, but in your own words. So instead of just rattling off quotes and not really interpreting it in any kind of way, try to explain it to someone who doesn't really know anything about this subject at all. Explain it in layman's terms without any of a jargon. You've probably heard about the Feynman Technique. This is what basically he's saying in that. It's explaining it very clearly, almost like you're explaining it to a 6-year-old. Finally, we move on to the idea of repetition, and this is another important part of it. Now, it's not enough just to look at quotes over and over again. Like, that is one way you can remember what you're reading, but not a particularly effective one. I think you can go a couple of steps further here, but I do look at some of these quotes from time to time. Readwise has another great feature where it will email me some of the highlights I've made in my Kindle books straight into my email address as well. So every day I get like a daily Readwise snippet of just 5 quotes, and I have a look through them, and that will help me to remember through repetition. But either way, I try and create more repetition in what I'm reading is just using what I've read for something else. So taking what I've read and basically using it for a purpose, using it with intention. This could be making a YouTube video about a certain book, or talking about it on a podcast, or like I say, talking about it with a friend. Just finding ways to purposely over and over again use what it is you're learning is this way you can take it from that short-term memory to that long-term memory. For example, I have a book club, which I have every month, which helps me with at least 1 book a month, which encourages me to repeat talking about what it is I've read, to look at quotes over and over again coming up to the book club. That's one way to do it. Obviously, this only works for 1 book a month. I'm trying to read 50 in a year, so it doesn't work for every book, but that is one way for probably the more important books. You can also write summaries of a book. This is something I'm trying to get into a bit more often now, like writing down key points, writing down my favourite quotes, maybe my 3 favourite takeaways from the book, in my own words, once again, the way I remember it, so that going forward, I can remember it in my own words as opposed to just trying to remember some quotes from the book. So that is it for how I remember the things I've been reading recently. Like I say, I think I'm kind of at the baby step stage of all of this, but I found it really exciting, and I found that so far in the 25 or so books I've read so far this year, I've remembered quite a lot more than I normally would, so it's working in some way. I think I can push it a little bit further. If you guys have any ideas or suggestions for me about how I can get better at remembering what I'm reading, please do leave them in the comments. I would really appreciate reading them. That would be awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, that is it from me, guys. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Please press like and subscribe and the bell icon so you get more videos like this one, and I will see you for another video next week. Thanks again, guys. Cheers.